This weekend, there's a possibility of our first tropical cyclone developing just off the southeast coast. If we were to take a look right now at the current water vapor imagery for the entirety of the Atlantic, we do see that there's a strong amount of wind shear going on right over the Gulf of Mexico as well as the western Atlantic, which is typical during the month of May. We're still not even in the hurricane season yet, so of course wind shear would still be very strong at this point of the year. However, there could be the possibility that the wind shear might just be light enough for a tropical cyclone to develop just off the southeast coast by this weekend. We do see that the clouds are drifting towards the east, which means that there's a strong upper level low located just to the north of this storm that's bringing the strong wind shear, but we could see the wind shift towards a direction that would promote tropical cyclone activity by next week. Take a look at what the European model is stating at this time. We do see that there's a slow meandering right over the Carolinas that brought heavy rain as well as gusty winds right up along the coast. But of course, this low is beginning to weaken as it's really beginning to lose the instability as well as the strong pressure gradient that was between this ridge and this low. So it'll slowly weaken over land, and of course, it locks contact with the very warm Gulf Stream water. So it will weaken, but it will still stay over the Carolinas for the next couple of days, which could be key in developing this next potential tropical cyclone. Now, moving forward, we do see that there's going to be an upper level low that's going to stay over the Gulf of Mexico for quite some time. We do see that the low just off the Carolinas does strengthen a little bit, but moving forward, even beyond that point, we see a pretty strong area of thunder showers moving through the Caribbean as a result of this upper level low, and that's going to bring potentially just enough convection for a well-defined center of circulation to develop just off the southeast coast. Now, moving forward into this weekend, into the Friday and Saturday timeframe, right between June 2nd and June 3rd, we do see that there's a small low that develops just off the coast of Florida, and while it moves out to sea and it's fairly weak for the most part, we do see that this low pressure system could become a little bit stronger as we approach potentially next week into Sunday, where it just meanders. There's a blocking pattern going on where we do see a strong ridge located just to the northwest of this storm, northeast of this storm, while we see another strong ridge located just to the northwest. So that's gonna make this low sort of stay over the same area for several days, since the steering flow is going to be very weak over this storm as we approach this weekend. And it's not until a small upper level low is able to sneak down to the northeast where we're going to begin to see this low pressure system speed up and move northward towards the northeast, and that's when it could become a little bit stronger. Now, this could easily be considered just a regular mid-latitude low, not necessarily a tropical storm or even a subtropical storm, as it might attain more subtropical characteristics rather than tropical characteristics, because it definitely will most likely need at least some help from baroclinic influences such as instability to strengthen, which wouldn't be considered a fully tropical cyclone, because we also have to keep in mind that the sea surf temperatures just off the southeast for the most part are still just under 80 degrees. We do have a small patch where the sea surf temperatures are over the 80-degree threshold, but for the most part, the temperatures around this area are hovering more around the mid to upper 70s. So that is a little bit too cold for most tropical cyclones to develop, at least in a fully tropical manner. So it's definitely going to need some subtropical and baroclinic influences for this storm to strengthen, but this could definitely become a subtropical storm if everything goes right. Now, we do see that the pressure will hover around 1,000 millibars. I'll say most likely this will this will be classified as a regular mid-latitude low. This won't necessarily go under the name of subtropical or tropical in this case, like the European model is suggesting, but however, we need to keep in mind that we're still 6 to 7 days out from this storm actually developing, or at least this low pressure system from really developing up to this point. So there's still a lot of days to iron out the forecast, and we have seen the computer models in their previous runs lean a little bit more towards this developing into more of a tropical entity. So there's definitely something to keep in mind. But whether this develops into a tropical storm or subtropical storm, or it's just a regular low pressure system, there still could be impacts right up along the East Coast, especially when we do see this low pressure system strengthen quite a bit by the time this approaches the Northeast at 994 millibars, which is definitely very powerful for a low pressure system this late into the year, because typically we don't see nor'easters develop this late into the season since the baroclinic instability isn't there. However, we do see it in this case where the pressure does drop down to low. Now, by the point at which this low pressure system is located this far up north in latitude, it's most definitely going to be more of an extratropical cyclone. It won't attain any tropical characteristics, but this still could bring gusty winds and potentially some coastal flooding in some areas up along the northeast coast, depending on how strong this low pressure system is. But the track will also be important. We do, and there's still a pretty bit noticeable difference between the tracking between the European model as well as the GFS model, where the GFS model wants to steer the storm a lot further eastward into the open Atlantic, since the GFS model expects an upper level low that's expected to eventually steer this low pressure system further up northward to be a lot further eastward, which would steer, of course, this low pressure system further eastward if this upper level low were to take that dip further eastward. So that's definitely something we're going to need to pay close attention to over the next several days. However, there's other factors we're going to need to pay close attention to to really determine if this will actually develop into a tropical storm. Of course, the wind shear will be very important. Right now, it seems like the wind shear, for the most part, will still stay very strong over this low pressure system even as we approach this coming weekend. But the thing is that the direction of this low pressure system could move to the northeast, which would be at around the same direction as where the upper level winds would move. And if the winds are able to move in the same direction, even though the upper level winds would be a lot stronger, that would definitely the wind shear won't be that strong enough to necessarily make it impossible for a tropical cyclone to develop, because it's still certainly possible, even with strong upper level winds, that a tropical cyclone could develop as long as a tropical cyclone moves in the same direction and as long as the surface winds primarily move in the same direction, which would create winds just strong enough along the eastern side of this low for it to be classified as a tropical cyclone. We're going to need to really see to determine the direction of the surface winds as well as upper level winds to really determine if this will have a good shot of developing even under the midst of very strong wind shear, which is likely going into this weekend. Let me show you guys a wind shear map right now. So here's a wind shear forecast from the European model, where the air pressure is at 200 millibars, which is considered the upper level of the atmosphere. We do see that the upper level winds are expected to come from a southwesterly direction, and the upper level winds are quite strong. So in a typical case, if a low pressure system were to move into wind shear this strong, the conditions would be very unfavorable for tropical cyclone development. However, if this low pressure system is able to move at a similar direction as wind shear, that would limit the wind shear enough, and that would maybe strengthen the easterly winds the southerly winds of this low pressure system enough to where it could still develop under the midst of the strong upper level winds. So we're going to need to pay very close attention to the exact direction of this low pressure system. And we do see the European model wants to take it at a similar direction as the upper level winds. So that could definitely enhance the risk of this developing into a tropical storm. Now let's take a look at the humidity, because that's another big factor associated with tropical cyclone development. There needs to be enough moisture surrounding it and not a lot of stable air, because that creates a temperature inversion in the low levels and in the mid levels of the atmosphere, where that very warm and humid air won't be able to rise up into the upper levels and create a heat engine, which is required for what tropical cyclones in general. So let's take a look at the humidity map right now. So here's a forecasted humidity map between the mid levels of the atmosphere from the European model. And moving forward with the forecast, let's move on into this weekend. Once when the tropical cyclone development, it will be at its peak, or at least that will be the most likely time frame when a tropical cyclone will develop just off the southeast. And we do see that it does have a small bubble of moisture on the north side, but we do see a high amount of stability on the southern side. So I'll say most likely, based on what we're seeing right now, it's unlikely that we're going to see this develop into a tropical entity, but there's still a lot of days to really iron out the forecast. So stay tuned for further updates. We're definitely going to need to see if the low pressure system will be able to fend off the strong upper level winds that will likely be over this storm by the time this approaches the western Atlantic, as well as the amount of dry air on the southern side. And if it's able to at least develop a consolidated and well-defined center of circulation, even under the strong stability that would be on the southern side of this low pressure system, we're going to need to pay very close attention to those factors moving forward. But again, whether this develops into a tropical entity or not, we could still see very heavy rain and strong winds up along the northeast coast. So definitely at least be aware of this, right? Pretty much all throughout the east coast, because there is that possibility that a strong coastal low could develop by this weekend into early next week. So here's what the GFS model is forecasting regarding this low pressure system just off the southeast coast. So if we were to continue to move forward, we do see that the GFS model wants to steer this low well further out to sea, which would definitely be good news and spare the east coast from much of any impacts, because the GFS model expects, like I said, the upper level low that's expected to dip down. The GFS model expects that upper level low to dip down a lot further eastward, which would force the low pressure system further eastward as well, which would certainly be good news that it'll stay well off the coast of the United States. And it does become quite strong once it approaches the northern Atlantic in this scenario, but it definitely won't be a tropical entity this far up north, where the sea surface temperatures are still hovering around the 60s right over this area. And it's definitely getting a lot of help from baroclinic influences, which is enhancing the instability around the center of circulation. So it isn't a tropical entity at all at this point, but maybe Eastern Canada still needs to pay close attention to this by early next week, where you could experience strong winds and heavy rain if this low pressure system still takes a similar trajectory, where we do see that the pressure will drop down to 974 millibars, which is quite powerful. So Eastern Canada, you might need to pay close attention to this by early next week. But for the United States, at least in the GFS model scenario, definitely misses out on much of any impacts associated with this low pressure system, which would certainly be good news. But we're definitely going to need to see how the computer models shift their forecast over the next several days before we could jump to the conclusion that this coastal low will move out to sea and not impact the United States. Take a look at the 500 millibar geopotential height anomaly forecast. We do see that over the next several days, there's going to be an upper level low just lingering over the Gulf of Mexico. And like I said, we do have a big ridge that's sort of making this upper level low stay over the same area for several days, as the upper level low is trying to steer the storm to the east and to the west, and there's not really anything that's trying to steer this to the east, as the jet stream is relegated well further northward of this upper level low. And continuing to move forward, we do see the upper level low does eventually gradually move eastward, and we do see a big blocking pattern again right over the northern Atlantic, and we do see it'll strengthen a little bit, and it'll continue to move further eastward as a result of this low located right over the northern Atlantic, which will steer it just a little bit further eastward. But it's not until we see this upper level low dip down between this blocking of the ridges, which will steer this low pressure system further northeastward and out to sea of the United States. Now, where exactly this dip occurs will be key in determining the track of this upper level low, because the European model currently wants to take this dip a lot further closer to the northeast, which would bring more impacts along the east coast, while the GFS model wants to steer this a lot further eastward because this upper level low dips down a lot further eastward. So we're gonna need to pay close attention to that by next week, but I'll keep you guys updated. So here are the current sea surf temperatures throughout the northern Atlantic, and like I said, there's only a small patch where the sea surf temperatures are over 80 degrees just off the southeast coast there. But however, even though the temperatures might be slightly colder than the required threshold for tropical cyclone development just off the southeast coast, there's still that possibility that we could see just enough baroclinic influences, and we could still at least see some tropical characteristics for this to maybe be considered a subtropical cyclone, where the instability will certainly help strengthen this storm, but it'll also have its own heat engine which is necessary for any fully tropical cyclone for this to potentially be considered Tropical Storm Arlene by this weekend. However, the chances, I'll say, are still low, but it's at least something to be aware of just off the southeast coast and along the east coast in general, because you could still see impacts as far north as the northeast by early next week. So definitely stay tuned for more forecasts, as I'll keep you guys updated over the next several days. So here's my area of future concern regarding this low pressure system that's expected to develop just off the southeast. It should, for the most part, I'll say most likely stay off the northeast, the southeast and northeast coast. But this is an area where you're most likely going to experience tropical development. If we were to see tropical development, I will still say the chance of a tropical storm developing is still low, but again, it's still fairly far out, so we could see changes in the forecast. And again, whether this is a tropical storm or just a regular low pressure system, you could still see impacts like you would see with a regular tropical storm, as this storm would likely bring heavy rain as well as gusty winds along the coast anyways, whether it's tropical or not. So you still want to be aware of this along the east coast. But thank you guys for watching, and make sure to subscribe for more hurricane season updates.